I think these myths, the danger in these myths lies in the fact that they distract us from paying attention to the dietary changes and the focus that actually matters, making the dietary changes that actually matter.
Welcome to the Healthful Pursuit Podcast. It's going to take me a hot moment to get used to saying that. If you're new around these parts, I just renamed my show after years and years and years of it being the Keto Diet Podcast. So here we are. Same host, same awesome stuff happening, just a different name. Let's go. So today we're talking about mental health. And I love this topic because as somebody who was diagnosed with ADD in my teens, I was told that there was really nothing I could do and I would have to take medication for the rest of my life. Fast forward a bunch of years, having used the ketogenic diet to completely change my entire being, I no longer take my medication. And I love that our guest, Dr. Georgia, today talked about this very thing, that at first, we need to get really strict around what changes we're making with our diet, but the changes we can make with our diet completely impact our mental health. And we get to a point where our mental health is actually better. We can start to build upon that and see kind of where the limits are. And I've definitely found that I found my limits within how to maintain being off my medication for the rest of my life while still being able to live my life and have the freedom around diets. We're talking about this very thing. But I think the biggest piece that I want you to take away from today, and I think Dr. Georgia did a great job at highlighting this, was that mental illness is on a spectrum. So whether you're dealing with ADD, autism, developmental issues, concerns with Alzheimer's, mood disorders, preparing for pregnancy and keeping your mind sharp for this, or just dealing with a slight PTSD or anxieties, depression, brain fog, fatigue, those sorts of things where we just think, oh, I'm aging, it's fine for my brain to decline. It's not. So all of these things happen on a spectrum. And I found the conversation to be super encouraging when it comes to you have control to make substantial changes very quickly if you dedicate yourself to the purpose. And so Dr. Georgia is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist specializing in nutrition science, brain metabolism, and mental health, which is just so needed today. Her 2 decades of clinical experience include 12 years at Smith College and Harvard University Health Services, where she was the first to offer nutrition-based therapies as an alternative to psychiatric medications. Dr. Eade speaks internationally about dietary approaches to psychiatric disorders, nutrition science, and nutrition policy reform. She is also the creator and director of the first medically accredited course in ketogenic diets for mental health practitioners. In 2022, she co-authored the first inpatient study of the ketogenic diet for serious mental illnesses and was honored to be named a recipient of the Basuki Brain Research Fund's first annual Metabolic Mind Award. You can find more from her by going to diagnosisdiet.com. And she also has a book called Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. And I will include the link in the show notes today. You can find more, including notes and supports over at healthfulpursuit.com/podcast. That's where you're going to find all the show notes moving forward. So that's healthfulpursuit.com/podcast. We'll have details about our sponsors and all the show notes and ways to connect with guests. So that's where to go. So like I said, we're going to be talking about mental illness on a spectrum, the diet aspect of this, how eating right and exercising may not be enough and that you might not be doing the right things in the right capacity. We're going to be talking about brain foods and the issues with that and really how to set up your diet for brain health, like to actually make changes. A big part of what we talked about truly was the metabolic piece to brain function. We delved really deep into glucose regulation, insulin. I really picked her brain when it came to when we're talking about glucose regulation, like what are the numbers that we're looking for? Why are these metabolic issues happening and how do we control them? And how do we kind of figure out if we're dealing with a metabolic issue that's affecting our brain health? So we spent a ton of time kind of in the trenches around that. So I hope that if you're looking for a brand new perspective to how do I make my brain function better, I'm having a hard time. I hope this brings light to a challenging conversation. So let's get right down to it. I hope you enjoy our time with Dr. Georgia Ede. Hey, my name is Leanne, and I'm fascinated with helping women navigate how to eat, move, and care for their bodies. This has taken me on a journey from vegan, keto, high protein to everything in between. I'm a small town holistic nutritionist turned 3-time international bestselling author turned functional medicine practitioner, offering telemedicine services around the globe to women looking to better their health and stop second guessing themselves. I'm here to teach you how to wade through the wellness noise to get to the good stuff that'll help you achieve your goals. Whether you're seeking relief from chronic ailments, striving for peak performance, or simply eager to live a more vibrant life, this podcast is your go-to resource for actionable advice and inspiration. Together, we'll uncover the interconnectedness of nutrition, movement, sleep, stress management, and mindset, empowering you to make informed choices that support your unique health journey. Think of it as quality time with your bestie mixed with a little med school so you're empowered at your next doctor visit. Get ready to be challenged and encouraged while you learn about your body and how to care for it healthfully. Join me as we embrace vitality, reclaim our innate potential, and discover what it truly means to pursue healthfulness. Hi, Dr. Georgia. How's it going?
Great. How's it going for you?
I'm so thrilled that we get to chat about this because I don't know too much about the brain other than I use the ketogenic diet to completely overcome ADD. So I have some of my own thoughts, but I'm sure you have a whole wealth of knowledge that I cannot wait to dig into. So I'm just so thrilled and honored to have you on the show today.
It's really an honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it sounds like you actually do know quite a bit about the brain because you have your own personal experience using dietary changes to improve a mental health condition. And that's what my book is all about. And that's what my work is all about. So it's a good match.
And how did you get going on this? Because I know when I was diagnosed with ADD, the doctors said there's really nothing I could do other than to take medication. And for the first, I would say 15 years of having this diagnosis, I didn't hear of anyone changing it with diet. And so how did you get going with this? What was the spark that kind of lit this path that you're now on?
Yeah, we really weren't taught about the connection between food and the brain, not in medical school, not in 4 years of medical school, not in 4 years of psychiatry residency training. None of my colleagues were working in the field of nutrition and mental health. So it never crossed my mind that the brain cared a great deal about what we eat, which it does. And I got interested for my own selfish health reasons, so I practiced normally, using medications and psychotherapy the first 10 years of my practice. And I loved my work. And, I really learned a lot, by working with people who are struggling with different types of mental health conditions, using medications and psychotherapy. I still use medications and psychotherapy in my work now, but for the past at least 12 years, 12 to 15, depending on how we're counting, I've been using almost exclusively nutrition as my primary intervention to help people. And it was because in my early 40s, about 15 years ago, I developed some very common health issues that a lot of women who are entering middle age come across, and a lot of my own patients were telling me about things like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and IBS and migraine headaches and sleep issues and just generally not feeling well, despite doing everything I thought I was supposed to be doing to take care of myself, eating right and exercising and that sort of thing. So long story short, I had all kinds of tests. Everything was normal. I started experimenting with my diet just kind of instinctively to try to help myself feel better. And ultimately ended up through trial and error of changing my diet, ended up with a diet that was almost completely upside down from what we're told to eat. And it resolved every single one of the problems that I was having. And then on top of that, my mental health, which I had never thought was particularly bad, improved really noticeably. So my mood, my energy, my concentration, my productivity, these were things I weren't even trying to improve. I wasn't even trying to improve. I was trying to improve the physical symptoms of what I thought was middle age. So that got me thinking. As a psychiatrist, I thought, well, this upside down diet seems to be really good for the brain, but it's not a diet that I feel comfortable recommending to my patients because it's so different from what the general recommendations are. The guidelines tell us. And so I decided to study nutrition independently for the first time, really just read everything I could get my hands on about nutrition to try to understand what we know and don't know about nutrition science. And I'm still immersed in that world today, learning new things all the time. But I think the bottom line is that almost everything I thought I knew about nutrition was completely wrong.
It's hard to sit down as a practitioner and realize that you were wrong and that you directed individuals in the wrong way. And I think that that tells a lot about an individual's character, that they're like, okay, we need to redo this. We need to kind of go back to the basics. So it's incredible that you were given that gift, although it was a challenge to probably go through that yourself. There's something about an individual that goes through it personally that has just a special place in their heart. I've been in this space for 20 years and have onboarded countless individuals that have H. pylori, and I would just see it on their GI map, address accordingly, bing, bang, boom, until I got H. pylori myself. And now anytime I see anyone with H. pylori, I'm like, are you comfortable? Are you okay? Are you sleeping well? How uncomfortable are you? Do you need something for your stomach comfort? Because it takes a practitioner sometimes to go through those sticky bits to then have compassion over those individuals who are coming to their practice. And so, though I'm sure it was challenging for you to experience firsthand some of these issues, I'm sure that it gives you just a special compassion toward the individuals that you are getting to help on a day-to-day basis. Which is what leads me to my next question, which is, could you give us a taste of what you're seeing in your practice now that you've studied nutrition, you've brought this into your practice? Can you give us a taste of what you're seeing as the changes, what sorts of people are coming to you and with what ailments, and what's the feeling that people are getting as they're going through these different practices? And we'll get into the flow of things. I just want to give people a taste of what you're seeing in your practice.
Yeah, so for the first 10 years of my practice, as I was saying, I used medications and psychotherapy. Those were the tools that I was given as a psychiatrist in my training. And I found, even though they were interesting to use and they were somewhat helpful, that these tools failed most of my patients. Most of my patients were just not getting that much better. And you might think, well, maybe she just didn't have enough experience. She's fresh out of residency. Maybe she just needed many more years of wisdom and experience. But when I looked around at my colleagues who had been practicing for 20, 30 years, the same thing was true for them, that their practices were also filling up with people who weren't getting that much better. And this is what we were taught to expect as psychiatrists. We were taught that, remission from serious mental illnesses is not possible, that medications are frustrating to work with, that psychotherapy medications have their limitations and their side effects, and they're expensive and they take a long time. And so, it's one of those professions where you're going to have a lot of patients who just don't get that much better. We were taught to think of mental illnesses as kind of chronic and mysterious and incurable. And that most of our job was going to be hanging in there with people and supporting them and, giving them, trying to give them hope and trying to stick by them and listen to them and validate their experiences, but not to necessarily tell them that they could hope for full recovery. And so now, the way I practice now, and a small but growing number of my colleagues practice this way now as well. This is a movement that started really in the past couple of years. It's really exciting. This is a very exciting time to be a psychiatrist because we now have these really powerful root cause interventions, nutritional psychiatry and metabolic psychiatry, with these brand new tools that actually are so powerful that we are seeing in my own practice, in research that I've helped publish, and in other kinds of studies that are being done by colleagues around the world. We are seeing people completely recover from even very serious mental illnesses, sometimes within just days to weeks. And so the reason I wrote this book is because this is the most powerful tool that I've ever had at my disposal. And most people aren't aware of it. And so dietary changes can be powerful treatments for mental health conditions of all kinds. they can help you in ways that no medicine can, but you have to know which changes are the ones that are most worth making, and they're not the ones we're used to hearing about.
Can you tell us what mental illnesses you're referring to? Like we talked about ADD at the beginning. What other things, just so we can classify those individuals listening that might have some of these, what we're talking about?
Yes. And so one of the reasons I love that question is because a lot of people who have mental health problems don't identify as having mental illness. So the word mental illness, or the phrase mental illness, we think of, serious mental illnesses. We think of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, maybe severe OCD. But, this also includes people with PTSD, with ADHD, with crippling anxiety disorders, with panic attacks, with obsessive worry, with early cognitive impairment, what's called mild cognitive impairment, which often will be sort of the first step on the road to Alzheimer's disease, autism in children. And so really just about any issue with mental health, whether it's interfering with your productivity, your mood, your energy level, the way you think about things, your ability to function in the world, anything, if you do not have robust mental health, then you may fall somewhere on this spectrum of mental unwellness to mental illness. And it really is a spectrum. So it's a matter of degree. And I think most of us have been taught to expect very little of our mental health. We're kind of, often told that, it's normal to not be able to recover from a serious trauma or stress or loss in our lives. We're told that, it's okay to fall apart and not be able to pull yourself back together even after many months, that it's normal for the brain to fall apart as we get older and to lose memory and concentration and productivity and not be able to function. And just as I know you focus a lot on your show on keeping your body healthy, strong, and resilient and metabolically well throughout the rest of your life, the same is possible for your brain too. Again, if you have the right information.
Such an empowering message. And there was something that you said a little bit ago about eating right and exercising, and you've hinted at it a couple of times with the dietary guidelines. Most of the women listening to the show have their diet pretty dialed in. Yeah, of course, we might eat a pint of ice cream here and there, but we kind of know, quote unquote, what's good for our bodies, what's not so good for our bodies. But when you said eating right and exercising, that tells me that there's maybe something more to this that we're not seeing. What did you mean by that when you said, I was eating right, I was exercising, kind of like I thought I was doing everything right, but it was still contributing to that spectrum of mental unwellness? Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yes, so the ideas that maybe it will help to sort of explain where my personal context in terms of my own diet history, because most women have a diet history. And so, I was overweight as a kid, even in first or second grade. I was one of the only overweight kids in my class. And now it's very common, for kids to be overweight. But back then it was rare. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and it was unusual to be overweight. So it was challenging. So I've been on every diet in the world. And so have most people in my family, been on every diet in the world over time. And as I got older, I had to keep changing my diet so that it would work. So when I was younger, I could just count calories and exercise. And then as I got older, I discovered that wasn't working as well. I did a South Beach diet. That was more of a low glycemic carbohydrates. Then I discovered the Atkins diet, and then I discovered ketogenic diets. I mean, I just had been through, I've been a Weight Watchers, just every diet you can imagine. But what I didn't understand was that how to keep my metabolism healthy, so that my metabolism wouldn't be deteriorating over time, that there were certain things I wasn't doing properly. And there were certain foods I was still including that were working against me that I thought were good for me. For example, at the time when I was experiencing these health problems in middle life, I was eating what I thought was a healthy diet, but I was really primarily focused on controlling my weight. I mean, that's how I thought about food. I thought about my food choices, as I think most women with weight issues do. I thought about my food choices as primarily a way to control my weight. I never thought about my food choices as having the power to nourish or properly energize or protect my brain from damage over time, or the rest of my body either. I really just was looking at that scale. I was looking in the mirror and I was looking on the scale. I wasn't thinking about, well, mood, energy levels, concentration levels, metabolic flexibility, resilience, the ability to think clearly and feel good and be stable and well. I was really just looking in the mirror and at the scale. And I think a lot of women still do that. Probably not listeners of your program because they're more savvy. But I wasn't thinking about my mental health or my longevity or my future cognitive health, protecting my memory for a lifetime. So I didn't understand that whole foods, yes, a whole foods diet, it's really important to follow whole foods principles, but I didn't understand that not all whole foods are created equal. Not all whole foods are good for us. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand if I was counting calories or carbohydrates, that food quality also mattered. That, okay, if I'm going to eat a low carbohydrate diet, does that mean that I can have lots of processed foods with, sweeteners and these keto bars and all kinds of other things? And that to try to continue eating some of this ultra processed convenience foods, I thought, well, as long as I keep under my carb limit, then that's okay, right? I didn't understand the risks of continuing to eat ultra processed foods. And I have a much better appreciation for that now. So what I've done in the book is taken all the good principles of metabolic quality of diet, which for some people, it's really just keeping your glucose and insulin levels in a healthy range. And for some people, that may just mean eating low glycemic. Some that may mean eating low carb. Some that may mean eating ketogenic. It's going to vary depending on lots of different personal factors, but also the nutritional quality of the diet. Are the foods providing with all the nutrients you need? And is your diet relatively free of damaging ingredients like not just refined carbohydrates, but also vegetable oils and whole grains and legumes and things that we're taught to think of as very healthy for us. So I think I just didn't appreciate how important it was to use both of those principles, not just for my own health, but to apply that and help my patients use these really powerful levers to improve their mental health.
And I feel like this is such a great segue into metabolic psychiatry, which is something you mentioned previously. And I'd like to just understand a little bit more about what that is. Can you tell us what it is and how that relates to what you just mentioned?
So there are two actually very new branches, sort of subspecialties in psychiatry. One is modern nutritional psychiatry. It's been around a little more than 10 years. And the thought leaders in nutritional psychiatry most of them focus primarily on the Mediterranean diet as a recommended diet for better brain health. And then there's the even newer subspecialty of metabolic psychiatry, which is interested in understanding the relationship between our metabolic health, our glucose and insulin levels and things like that, and our mental health. So to what extent does having, for example, unstable blood glucose and insulin levels or prediabetes or insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, to what extent do those conditions influence our mental health? How exactly do these things influence our mental health, and what can we do about it?
The key to a successful diet is successful snacks. Now, you might disagree with me, but I look at so many food logs in a week, and I can tell you that when we don't have healthful snacks dialed in, we know exactly what makes us thrive, easy access, no GMOs, no sugar alcohols, no gluten, no grain, no corn, no soy, just healthy, good snacks with no natural flavors or seed oils, just good, pure snacks. When we have that dialed in, when hunger strikes and we have that thing that we reach for time and time and time again, and we are consistent with that, it is the name of the game. Now, of all of the snacks that I have had over the course of the last decade, my absolute favorite snack that I recommend to almost every client that's struggling to just snack healthfully and bridge the gap between meals or even have a little mini meal is 100% grass-fed beef sticks from Paleo Valley. They are by far the most delicious, most nutritious snack out there when it comes to hitting our protein goals. Their sticks are beyond grass-fed and sourced from grass-fed and finished American farms using regenerative practices to restore environmental health. Their high quality beef is so flavorful that they only have to add organic spices rather than MSG, gluten, sugar, and other stuff found in meat sticks. They're also not super chewy. They're just soft and delicious. 100% grass-fed, sourced from U.S. family farmers, keto, paleo. They only use organic spices. They're fermented for your gut health. They contain no ECAs. They have 0 grams of carbs, 0 sugars. They're satiating. They're great for on the go, and they are going to fill that gap. I promise you. So you can find more by going to paleovalley.com/keto. And on that page, you're going to find my favorite Paleo Valley items. You're going to see the beef sticks there. You can use the code KETO, all in caps, for 15% off when you go to paleovalley.com/keto. So how would you define unstable insulin and glucose? Because I've worn continuous glucose monitors, and depending on what app you use will determine what unstable glucose is. Like, for example, the Levels app will say anything over 110 is considered unstable. But I mean, I work out 5 days a week. I use carbohydrates around my workouts so that I can push myself hard, and my glucose will go over that amount, especially when I'm working out. Or with insulin, I've seen individuals say that anywhere up to 20 is okay, but above that is not good. Like, when you say unstable, can we kind of define that so people understand kind of what your approach would be?
Great. I'm so glad you asked this. So there's a whole chapter in the book about this, so people can, if they want to, they can use home glucose monitoring to figure out, where they stand on the insulin resistance spectrum and where they stand on the spectrum of good metabolic health, right? And so using things like a continuous glucose monitor or even a finger stick monitor or using a ketone monitor, these things can all give you useful insights into your metabolism. But so what I describe in the book is what I recommend in the book is that even if, so no matter what, that your glucose level should never go above 140 milligrams per deciliter. And ideally, perhaps not even above 125 after meals, right? And so I think there's less clarity around numbers that are lower than that. But I can with confidence say you really don't want your glucose, even after you've eaten, to go above 125 milligrams per deciliter. But everyone would agree that above 140 is dangerous. So there's that. So there are 2 signs when you're looking at your glucose readings, 2 signs of metabolic problems. One is if you're spiking too high, so above 125, 140, wherever you want to set it. The other is instability. So if you see a lot of variability in your glucose levels, and we're not just talking about, your glucose level, which will naturally rise after meals if you're including any amount of carbohydrate in your meal, of course, it's going to go up. We're not, talking about glucose levels that might go up or come down or around the times of exercise. We're talking about major swings in glucose levels multiple times per day, meaning glucose excursions of 30 milligrams per deciliter that are happening frequently. So if you look at that tracing, you see that's a lot of instability. The problem with that is that when the glucose levels are going up and down very frequently, the insulin levels also will be doing that. You can't see those. You can't, at least currently, measure your insulin levels in a continuous basis. The glucose level is one thing. The insulin is another, because every time you get a spike in glucose in the bloodstream, you will also get a spike in insulin to manage that glucose, to deal with the glucose. And it will bring it back down to normal. If you have good metabolic health, it will happen relatively quickly. But the problem is, if your glucose is very unstable, your insulin levels will also be very unstable. And if your insulin levels are unstable, it's not just about pulling your glucose down. Insulin's not, a lot of people are taught this, even most doctors think this way. Insulin is not simply a blood sugar regulator. It is a master metabolic hormone. It's actually a growth hormone, and it is controlling and influencing the levels and activity of many other hormones in the body, including reproductive hormones, including stress hormones, blood pressure regulating hormones, appetite regulation hormones. So when your glucose is on this roller coaster, you will also be, many other hormones will also be coming along for the ride. And that can create a lot of internal instability. So that even if things are going well around you, your life looks great, you've got enough money, you're in a happy relationship, everything's going well, you have everything you need, you can still, you can be stable on the outside, but you could still be very unstable on the inside. And so if it feels that way to you, that's one of the first places to look, is to look at your glucose and insulin levels and see if they may be playing a role in that sense of instability that you're feeling on the inside.
What role do you feel like walking after meals could play? Because I know for myself, when I started to see that CGM and I'm like, I should probably go for a walk around that 30-minute mark. When I go for a walk, the glucose gets nice and stable, starts to drop down, and all is well. Do you feel like that can play a role too in bringing stability when we are having meals that maybe spike and we're like, oh no, oops, I did it again? Like, did that work?
Yes, actually, and I mentioned this in the book as well, that one of the ways you can help to keep your glucose levels in a more stable range is to exercise after you eat. Go for a walk or do whatever it is you like to do. Move your muscles, use your muscles after you eat. And the reason for that is that exercising muscles soak up blood sugar like a sponge. So they absorb glucose right out of the bloodstream, no insulin required. So if you exercise right after you eat, you're not going to need that big spike in insulin to take care of all that glucose. So you protect yourself in two ways. You keep the glucose from spiking as high, but you also need less insulin to deal with that glucose because those working muscles will absorb a lot of that extra glucose. So exercise is your friend when it comes to metabolic health. You will be able to, quote, get away with, however you want to think about it. Your carbohydrate tolerance will be higher if you exercise.
Completely. And so we've talked a little bit about glucose measurements, and I find continuous glucose monitors, if you're really serious about it, just being really helpful, even for 2 weeks, to understand what's going on and how to apply it real time, because pricking your finger that many times, it's just not practical. We've talked about insulin being kind of a one-time marker. You go in for blood work and you get a sense. What are your thoughts on HbA1c or even C-peptide or glycomark to understanding this big picture of glucose regulation and insulin resistance?
Yes, I'm not familiar with glycomark. Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah, so it gives you an idea of glucose variability. Usually if the glycomark is low, it will give you a good sense of whether or not you've spent an increased amount of time over 180 milligrams per deciliter. And so, yeah, it can be a good marker to use to just get a snapshot of, is this person's glucose generally always over 180, or is it more less than that, just to get a sense of what their glucose is ongoing if they don't use a CGM, really?
Sure. Well, I certainly hope that nobody listening has a glucose that's spending time at 180 or higher. That's really dangerous, and you can change it quickly. But it is very dangerous. When your glucose is running too high in your bloodstream, it's also running too high in your brain, and that's very dangerous. The brain does need some glucose at all times, but it can't handle very much of it. And when glucose levels are higher than they should be in the brain, that excess glucose literally sticks to all kinds of vital brain components and can do serious damage over time, cause waves of inflammation, waves of oxidative stress, and create these sticky, kind of dysfunctional caramelized clusters called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. They're called AGEs, which is nice because they are largely responsible for premature aging of the brain and other tissues, so AGE. So you don't want too much sugar in the brain, which means you don't want too much sugar in the blood. You always need some, but you just don't want a lot. So you're asking about which markers are most useful. So CGMs are great if you can afford them. Not everybody can, but I agree with you, and I say this in the book as well. Even if you can just get one sensor for 10 to 14 days, that gives you tremendous insight, like a beautiful window into your metabolism. It gives you great information. The other thing is you asked about the hemoglobin A1C. The hemoglobin A1C is a reflection, as you know, of your average blood sugar over the past 3 months or so. So the problem with the standard tests, which are the fasting blood glucose and the hemoglobin A1C, that's what most people get when they go to their practitioner for their physical, is that the fasting glucose and the hemoglobin A1C can still be perfectly normal. Even if you have severe metabolic dysfunction, you can have had severe insulin resistance and high insulin levels and unstable glucose levels for years. You may be already on the brink of type 2 diabetes, and those two numbers can still be normal because they're the last dominoes to fall. So what you really want to know is, how much insulin are you having to pump out to keep that glucose in a normal range? That's what you really want to know. That's the beauty of the fasting insulin level, which ideally you want your fasting insulin level to be in the single digits. So, less than 10, but the fasting insulin varies. It's going to vary depending on what you ate the day before, right? So some days it may be higher, some days it may be lower. You might have gotten lucky and maybe it's below 10 that particular morning. So it's not a perfect measure, but there are other really simple, and these are all in the book too, but I'm just going to say them because if people don't read the book, I want them to know anyway. You can test your own metabolic health really easily for very, very little money, if any money at all. You can, for example, you can measure your waist circumference around your belly button. And if it's more than half your height, that's a clue to insulin resistance. You can look at your last cholesterol panel. Most people have had at least one cholesterol panel. Look at your triglycerides. Are your triglycerides higher than 100 milligrams per deciliter? That's a sign that you're eating more carbohydrate than your body can process. You really want those triglycerides to be less than 100. So that's another great thing to take a look at. Your fasting insulin level, if your doctor won't order it for you, it's very cheap. You can order it yourself through an online lab, costs maybe $10 or $15, even without insurance. It's a useful number. So, and the continuous glucose monitors, they're about to come out with one that's available over the counter here in the United States, finally. Here in the US, it still requires a prescription for no good reason that I can think of. And so this summer, at some point, Dexcom is coming out with an over-the-counter. Who knows how much it's going to cost, but they're going to come out with an over-the-counter glucose meter for continuous glucose meter for people who are curious to learn more about their metabolic health. So there are lots of ways that have nothing to do with the mirror or the scale that you can get a sense for where you stand on the insulin resistance spectrum, because really those types of numbers, those kinds of measurements, your fasting insulin level, your triglyceride level, your waist to height ratio, things like that, if those aren't in a healthy range, it's like a crystal ball that you're looking into and you're going to see your health future because insulin resistance is the number one root cause of most of the mental and physical health problems that we are all afraid that we are going to get or that we already have. And you can change those numbers really quickly. I mean, if you're overweight, it might take you months to lose the excess weight, but you can change your triglycerides, your fasting insulin, your fasting glucose. Your waist circumference is going to take longer, but if you do the things that you need to do to get your glucose and insulin levels under good control, the waist circumference will take care of itself as a beautiful side effect of you improving your metabolic health very quickly. So you can change these numbers within days to weeks if you have the right information.
Yes, I know when I tell my clients, okay, we're going to do blood work again. And they're like, it's only been 2 months. I'm like, have you been following the diet? Because if you have been, we're going to see your triglycerides lowered. Like that. Guaranteed if you've been doing what we set out to do. And that's an encouragement because then you see that number and you're like, wow, I may not feel it yet, but my cells are responding. I can see it on paper. And that is just a huge encouragement. The CGM is the same thing. When you can actually see those numbers, you're like, okay, what I'm doing, though I may not see it in the mirror, I may not feel it yet, I'm making a change. And I don't know about those listening, but I know that really motivates me to make different choices.
It's so empowering and so exciting and motivating to see, like we were both saying, it takes a while to see it on the scale, right? But your biology, your biochemistry changes, your metabolism changes, responds really quickly. And most people will feel better within a few weeks, even if they, haven't met all the goals that they were hoping to meet. But like you said, those numbers, the triglycerides drop like a stone in almost everybody. There are a few exceptions. In this study, that we published in 2022, where we, were observing what was happening for people with serious mental illnesses, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and major depression, in a hospital in France, these folks had, they were taking an average of 5 psychiatric medications. They had been ill for an average of 10 years, some of them for as long as 30 years. And, they were just not responding to conventional care. They came into the hospital, volunteered to do a ketogenic diet. Their triglycerides dropped like a stone. And, some of these people, their triglycerides dropped by 100 points or more within, it's just amazing. And these are also almost everybody in the study lost a clinically meaningful amount of weight, more than 5% of their body weight, even though they were taking antipsychotic medications in almost every case that are notorious for causing very stubborn and very substantial weight gain. So your metabolic health can improve very quickly, even if you've got some things working against you that other people don't need to worry about. So these are powerful interventions.
Can we talk a little bit about the nutrient need side of things? Because you mentioned it just like slightly about 20 minutes ago, and I made a little mental note. What did you mean by nutrient needs as it relates to mental health and taking care of our brain? Are you talking specific minerals, vitamins? What do we got going on there?
Yes. So there are certain nutrient deficiencies which are fairly common, at least here in the United States. They include, iron, zinc, omega-3 fatty acids like DHA, iodine. There are certain nutrient deficiencies, B12. There are certain nutrient deficiencies that are fairly common here in the United States. But they shouldn't be, because the people that are in these studies where these nutrients are being measured have access to plenty of food. So, it's one thing to look at, a group of people who, are malnourished and don't have access to healthy food, unfortunately. It's one thing for them to have nutrient deficiencies, and that is also a tragedy, and that needs to be corrected as well. But why are people in places, for example, in the area where I live, where I work, why is iron deficiency still considered acceptable for women of reproductive age, 20% of them, to have iron deficiency? That doesn't make any sense. We're told that, well, that's just what we should expect because, of course, women have monthly cycles and we lose some iron every month. But that's not logical. Why would a species be designed to run low on a critical nutrient? That doesn't make any sense. The reason why so many of us are deficient in these nutrients is because we have the wrong information about where the nutrients are and how we get them. So a very common myth is that you can easily meet your requirements for iron if you're basing your diet on things like grains and legumes and nuts and seeds. And if you look on the ingredient label, on the nutrition label for foods that are made with those ingredients, you might see the word iron on the label. You might see the word zinc. You might see calcium and magnesium. But what you're not seeing is that, yes, those plant foods that we're told to base our diet on, they do contain those minerals, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can access them, because plants naturally contain quite smartly and quite cleverly anti-nutrients that help them guard those nutrients for their own purposes. So just because a plant food contains a nutrient does not necessarily mean we can access it. And so it can be very difficult, even if you're eating plenty of nutritious animal foods that are rich in iron and in the proper kind of iron, which plants do not contain. Even if you're eating a certain degree of animal foods and think you're okay, you might still be running low on iron because you're eating so many anti-iron foods that we're told are important for a healthy diet. And I like to tell my patients, if you have iron deficiency, you don't just have a blood problem, you have a brain problem, because the brain needs iron to generate energy, which the brain requires in high amounts to generate electricity. And you also need iron to make certain neurotransmitters, such as dopamine. And so if your brain is running low on iron, it may not function properly. And this is especially important in the first 1,000 days of life when the brain is still developing. Iron deficiency early in life can have a significant effect on attention, concentration, and IQ that can never be made up for. You only get one chance to build a brain properly. So that's just one example of a nutrient that lots of people are deficient in that has real mental health consequences. And that is the result of us having the wrong information about nutrition science.
Yes, completely. And I see a lot with the iron pattern that one of the root causes behind the iron issue has to do with a lack of vitamin B6, zinc, copper, all of these nutrients required to absorb iron properly. And so not only is the individual lacking in iron, but usually like in the case of birth control, if they did a ton of birth control, their copper is built up and that affects iron. So it's like the whack-a-mole game when it comes to, it's not as simple as just eat a steak and hope for the best. If you don't have some of those key nutrients to absorb the iron, it's not going to work well.
That's exactly right. I mean, and this is where having a big picture understanding of nutrition is so important, because it's really easy to focus on one particular nutrient and know a lot about it and still completely miss the mark when it comes to understanding, you know what I mean? And so that's why, what you were just saying is so important. You have to think about nutrition in the context of the bigger picture. And you have to know which foods naturally give you all of those other elements that might be required to absorb the iron. And in many cases, those foods just happen to be, I know it's not a popular thing to want to believe, but they just happen often to be animal foods. And that's just, unfortunately, the truth of our biology. And so if you're not going to include some of those foods, you really need to know what you're doing when you're supplementing. You have to supplement very, very carefully and design your diet in a particular way to minimize the anti-nutrients in that diet.
Which brings us so well into what I want to talk about next, which was food selection. You see kind of out there the brain boosting foods, like 12 foods to change your life and change your brain function. What do you see that's wrong with these lists? We'll probably get back into the vegan stuff. And you mentioned vegetable oils before. I definitely want to get in there, but just overwhelmingly clients will come to me and say, yeah, I have this brain supplement. It has all these superfoods in it, or I prioritize XYZ. What do you see as wrong with that approach when it comes to those brain foods?
So two things. When it comes to nutrient supplements and these sort of special sort of brain supplement products, they may be helpful in some cases, especially if you're running low on certain nutrients. You may benefit from a supplement that contains certain nutrients. What I'm more interested in is, why are you deficient in that nutrient in the first place? I really do like to take a food first approach whenever possible. And it's not always possible, but I do prefer that way of working and that philosophy. The other piece is this superfood myth, the brain superfood myth. These myths, some of them are just kind of benign. They're just not true. For example, there's no evidence, for example, that eating more blueberries is going to do anything for your mental health. I've got evidence and explanations in the book about why the myths about superfoods of all kinds, including blueberries and dark chocolate and red wine and broccoli sprouts, all these kinds of things, why these are myths rather than truths. And you might think, well, what's the harm? What's the harm in, adding more of these so-called superfoods to my diet? Even if they don't work, they can't hurt me, right? Well, no, not usually. I mean, unless you're talking about red wine or lots of chocolate, because those are dangerous for your health. There's no question about it. But, what I think these myths, the danger in these myths lies in the fact that they distract us from paying attention to the dietary changes and the focus that actually matters, making the dietary changes that actually matter. So it's wonderful, it's beautiful and fun and easy to believe that all you have to do is sprinkle some superfoods on top of your diet and you're going to be protecting your brain. But that's actually not the way it works. There is no such thing as a brain superfood. If you want real change to your mental health, you have to make real change, fundamental changes to your whole diet. You have to restructure your diet from the ground up in ways that make biological sense. And when you do that, rather than just kind of sprinkling a few superfoods on top, or maybe just nibbling around the edges of the diet by maybe taking out some of the sugar, or maybe avoiding certain types of foods, if you just nibble around the edges or sprinkle something on top, you're not going to get real change. And this is why so many people think that nutrition interventions for mental health don't work, because they've tried a lot of these things and they don't notice any improvement. So they just go back to eating the way they were before and say, well, it clearly doesn't matter. I'm just going to eat everything in moderation. When actually there are really powerful interventions. If you know what the principles of a brain healthy diet are, you can restructure your diet in ways that can help you feel better in many cases within, again, I'm going to use this phrase because it's true, days to weeks of changing your diet. And people with mental health issues, especially who have run out of other options or who don't like the idea of taking medication or getting a lot of side effects from medication or can't afford medication, aren't responding well enough to medication, I really want them to know that these powerful tools are available. But the recommendations to get your brain on a healthier footing fly in the face of a lot of the recommendations that are in the mainstream nutrition guidelines and headlines that you'll see. And that's the problem, is that the beliefs we have and the recommendations we have are working against us.
What I'm hearing you say is that we need to make fundamental changes. And in many cases, it's a complete overhaul. Would that be a fair, if you're serious about this, you need to get in there with a bulldozer, knock it down and build. We're talking infill situation here. Would it be fair to say, if you're that committed, that's what I heard from you? Maybe it's just because I'm a very intense person. And when I get something in my mind, I'm like, yeah, we will do it. We will bulldoze this down. Is that kind of what you're saying of it's not enough to just sprinkle some chia seeds on your blueberry, whatever bowl and call it a day?
I couldn't have said it better. And I wish I had come up with that phrasing myself a long time ago, because it is perfect. I mean, it really is. And I would soften it only in one way. I would say, for most people, it is going to require a complete overhaul. You're going to take out the bulldozer, start from scratch. And that's what I do in the book, is I help people do that. But I would soften it only in this way, so that people don't run screaming for the exits or, hit the little X in the top of their computer and stop the video or the audio. Is I think it's really, you owe it to yourself to do this for at least 6 to 12 weeks. If you then don't notice any improvements, maybe it's not about your diet. Maybe you don't need to, maybe there's something else that's going on that's, driving the mental health issue that you're struggling with. But most people, when they level everything to the ground and start fresh, will notice significant improvements. And then what I've done in the book, to help people feel more flexible and allow people to personalize the approach, is if you do feel better with that approach, with that very clean, restructured approach that's kind of stripped your diet down to just the most important things, then you can experiment with expanding it and see if you can find the broadest, most varied, most enjoyable diet that you can tolerate that still maintains those mental health benefits. Because everyone's going to draw that line in a different place. And so I want people to know that that's the most efficient way to do it. Get out the bulldozer, start from scratch, but then you can gradually start to add things back in and see where your safe outer limit is.
Yes. I bet you want a tight and toned body. Those descriptions are all the rage right now. And let me tell you something. If you're under eating protein, you are not going to get there. You see, because tight and toned comes from muscle, not cardio. And more muscle also equals stronger metabolism, better sleep, more graceful aging process. And you need adequate protein to make all of this work. And I bet, like most people, you're not getting enough of it on a daily basis. Taking an amino supplement is one of the best, easiest, most cost-effective ways to get all the good stuff your body gets from protein. I started supplementing with Kion aminos, and I've experienced increased muscle growth, better recovery, and improved sleep. Kion aminos contains all 9 essential amino acids, or EAAs for short, in the most ideal ratios proven by science and are actually more effective than protein itself. Kion aminos are added to water, which makes it a great way to reap all the benefits of protein without filling your belly up. I simply take a scoop with each meal, and as I said, I've noticed far better recovery from my workouts and better muscle definition. To save 20% off Kion aminos, you can go to getkion.com/keto. That's GETKION.com/keto. And your purchase comes with a risk-free 60-day money-back guarantee. So if you hate it, which I don't think you will, you can get your money back, no questions asked. Getkion.com/keto to save 20% off Kion aminos. Okay, I want to spend the last couple of moments, just if you're cool with this, describing what I think most listeners, how they're eating, what their lifestyle is like, because I talk to so many of them, and maybe give us advice as to what could be some of their first steps. Because we've talked about glucose regulation. We've talked about the dietary guidelines being not so great when it comes to the conventional side of things. But I'd really like to, in these last few minutes, give women some sense of direction. Of course, grabbing your book being the next obvious choice, but just like to bridge that gap right now, maybe they were eating blueberries at 1 cup per day, thinking that that would be enough for their brain. And now they're totally freaking out. So would you be cool with me just kind of describing the listener and helping us through maybe some actions that they could take to help their brain?
I would love to do that.
Okay. So stay-at-home mom or working mom, generally speaking, she eats whatever she makes her kids, picking here and there, fasting when she just doesn't have time to eat. Generally, her carbohydrates are under 100 grams, but there are weekends where she eats just like whatever and goes and has the pizza and the popcorn and tries to dial it in, but not always great at it, and deals with a lot of brain fog and fatigue. That pretty much sums up most of the ladies that I speak with, of course, and such ongoing issues, especially when it comes to the brain fog fatigue piece and just picking and choosing the foods, like not being intentional with the meals that they're creating or balancing out things. Any advice for this individual when it comes to brain function overall?
Yes. Wow. This is fantastic. So, because I'm picturing this person, and I know lots of people like this and have lots of people like this in my own practice. So I think, these are people who are working really hard to take the best care of themselves that they can and of their children, right? And they're the ones who are making most of the decisions in the house about what everybody's eating, including themselves. And there's not always a lot of time. There's not always enough time. There's not always enough money. There's not always enough present, like being able to take time to stop and be present and plan. People are busy. So I think the most important thing for somebody like that to understand is which are the things that are most important. If you're going to splurge, what are the safer ways to splurge if you don't have time? And when you're making I do think it's worth it taking at least a day, some time, or a few hours at least, to understand what the foundation of the whole family's diet needs to be, what foods should be in the meal plans every day to make sure that people's nutrient requirements are being met, and which foods are the most important ones to avoid. So to get some sort of new standards in terms of, okay, we're going to eat this way from now on. We're not going to be perfect about it. We're going to have days off. We're going to have, exceptions when we don't have time or I've run out of something. But this household is going to start eating a brain healthy diet. And what that's going to look like is it's going to really look more like a paleo diet than any other kind. It's going to look a lot more like paleo than Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean diet, those grains and beans and lots of breads and pastas and cereals, no one is going to feel their best on that diet. And so we need a diet that has a core, at least of a certain amount of whatever animal foods you feel comfortable including in your diet, if you're willing to do that. The core of the diet's going to be, so like let's say for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, there's going to be some sort of animal protein in the meal. So it's going to be eggs, or it's going to be chicken, or it's going to be fish, or it's going to be beef or pork, or whatever it is you like to have. Part of that plate is going to be some sort of animal food. The rest of the meal is going to be fruits and vegetables and healthy fats. And it's really that simple. And then some people are going to need to eat a lower carbohydrate version of that diet. But the step one in my book is not a ketogenic diet, even though a ketogenic diet is the cornerstone of my practice as a metabolic psychiatrist who's trying to help people with serious mental health problems. The first step in my book is a 90 grams of carbohydrate per day paleo diet. So it's meat, seafood, poultry, eggs, fruits, vegetables. You can have carbohydrates at every meal as long as they're from healthy whole foods, but there are no grains, there are no beans, there's no dairy. We don't want to talk about that right now. And there are no ultra processed foods and added sugars or alcohol or anything like that. So if that's how you eat most of the time, you're going to be healthier than most people around you. Your kids will be healthier. You'll be healthier. You'll feel better. And then when you do splurge on something, try to keep it to a treat or an occasion, or a rare occasion, but try to develop these new healthy habits where you redefine what food is and what foods belong on the plate more often than not.
Yeah. I mean, you described my diet pretty much. And I love how also a couple of moments ago, you chatted about kind of taking that bulldozer, kind of getting in there, making sure that it's set up right. And over time, kind of seeing what those limits are. And I know for myself, having overcome ADD, using the ketogenic diet, I'm now eating a pretty substantial amount of carbohydrates because of my movement that I wasn't doing before, and my walking and my lifting. And all of those pieces contribute to my diet needing to be changed. And so I love that you touched on that just because we're making changes now doesn't mean that things aren't going to widen. And I think so many of us get stuck on, well, if it needs to be this way and how strict it is right now, it's always going to be like this. And I just can't commit to that. And what I'm hearing you say is that's not the case, but we need to see how you're going to respond to this so that we can see if we're on the right track. And then we can grow it over time as you respond correctly. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. And so what I like to say to my patients is, if they say, does this mean that I can never have ice cream again? Does it mean I can never have cookies again? And I say, never say never. I just say, let's start with an experiment. Let's just try this out as an experiment to see what's possible for you. Try this new way of eating for 6 to 12 weeks. See what's possible for you. And then we can have a discussion about what you want to do next. Because if you haven't experienced this other way of eating, if you haven't fed your brain properly, and which most of us have never done, because we've had we've been fed the wrong information about nutrition for decades. So we've been feeding our brains improperly our entire lives. Most of us have no idea how much better we could feel or function if we fed the brain properly. And you owe it to yourself to discover what that feels like. And then you can have a conversation with yourself about, well, how important is that ice cream to me? How often do I want to do that? And let me try it and see what happens. And you can do your own experiments and come to your own conclusions. And I'm nutritionally pro-choice. I want people to have control over their food and their food choices and have a diet that they can live with and enjoy. But I want them to have the right information so that the choices they make are informed choices.
Dr. Georgia, I feel like we could be best friends. You say everything. Right? And I'm like, yes, you're great. Yes, totally. Yes, 100%. Couldn't agree with you more. Where can people get your book? What's it called? Tell us how we connect with you, all of the ways that we can make sure that we follow your work.
Yeah, no, I've really loved this conversation. I feel totally simpatico. And, I can see why your work has been so popular. And so, the book is called Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. And you can get it wherever you'd like to get books. But if you want to learn more about the book or me or these principles, I have a website and it's called diagnosisdiet.com. There's information about the book there and all kinds of other things. But then there's also, I'm on social media quite a bit, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I'm still getting up to speed on Instagram, so bear with me. But I do my best to answer people's questions on social media. And so if you have a question, give me a try.
Give me a try. I love it. I will be sure to include those links in the show notes. Dr. Georgia, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much. It was really a lot of fun and a great pleasure.
I hope you really enjoyed that conversation. Again, you can connect with Dr. Georgia over at diagnosisdiet.com. And if you're unsure of any of the links or resources, you can head on over to healthfulpursuit.com/podcast, and all of the resources will be on that page. Okay, we'll see you back here next week for another episode of the Healthful Pursuit Podcast. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Healthful Pursuit Podcast. Join us next Tuesday for another episode of the show. If you're looking for free resources, there are a couple of places you can go. The first to my blog, healthfulpursuit.com, where you're going to find loads of recipes. The second is a free parasite protocol that I've put together for you that outlines symptoms, testing, and resources to determine whether or not you have a parasite, plus a full protocol to follow to eradicate them from your life if you need to. That's available at healthfulpursuit.com/parasites. And last but certainly not least, a full list of blood work markers to ask your doctor for so that you can get a full picture of your health. You can grab that free resource by going to healthfulpursuit.com/labs. The Healthful Pursuit Podcast, including show notes and links, provides information in respect to healthy living, recipes, nutrition, and diet, and is intended for informational purposes only. The information provided is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, nor is it to be construed as such. We cannot guarantee that the information provided on the Healthful Pursuit Podcast reflects the most up-to-date medical research. Information is provided without any representation or warranties of any kind. Please consult a qualified health practitioner with any questions you may have regarding your health and nutrition program.